What does it mean to be natural? This question depends entirely on the context. In terms of a woodlot, I think it's safe to say that after an area has been logged, it's no longer in its natural state. It's been disturbed. Now, logging is an incredibly prevalent industry in Canada. It provides thousands of people with jobs, provides a natural resource for trade, and historically, it's the backbone of our nation. In spite of your personal opinions on the timber industry, it's difficult to argue that we use what it provides for us every single day. The topic of logging itself can be controversial. There are practices that are done that, personally, I'm not a huge fan of. In British Columbia, the Forest and Range Practices Act requires that harvested areas be replanted with a free-growing stand of trees. A replanted cut block is no doubt better than taking what we want and leaving behind a desolate wasteland. What you take from the earth, you must give back. But a replanted cut block isn't exactly natural. I don't claim to be an expert in anything. In fact, I'm not even going to share my opinion on this topic. But instead, I encourage you to listen to today's episode with an open mind. The pros and cons of forestry practices could be debated until doomsday, but I'm not here to do that today. Today, I'm here to explore one perspective of a common practice used in the timber industry in BC. And joining me is James Steidle and Hengda Liu. James is a Prince George, BC local and an avid bushman. Throughout his career, he has worked closely with trees as both a tree planter and at a sawmill. Today, he works intimately with lumber through his craft in woodworking. Hengda is a forester and the recently retired host of the UNBC Forestry podcast. He's passionate about forestry and has dedicated much of his time to communication on the topic. He's a friend of mine and an all-around good guy. Without any further delay, let's get right into our conversation. My name is Michael Bryden, and you're listening to Wilder Insights. All right, well, I think we'll just hop right into things here. I'll have both of you introduce yourself. We'll start with you here.
Hi, my name's Hengda, and then really happy to join a podcast. And then I'm also a podcast with the UNBC Forestry Club podcast. So this is really interesting. The table has turned, and then now it's on the other side of the table. So really interesting to be here. Happy to be here.
Thanks for coming, man. I appreciate it.
No problem.
My name is James Steidle. Thanks for having me, Michael. I do, we were just talking about, I do a radio show on CFIS called Local Matters, and I do Stop the Spray BC. I guess that's why we're here today to talk about that issue. But I also write a column for the Prince George Citizen, kind of touch on a whole bunch of issues, local and otherwise.
That's perfect. Well, let's just jump right into what the issue is and the initiative you work through. Could you talk to us about Stop the Spray?
Sure. So it started in 2011, I guess officially. That's when we got the put the website online. And before that, so I have a background in forestry. I grew up in a sawmill, kind of literally at Clear Lake Sawmill. That was a little mill south of town. And my dad would work there. We lived further out in the bush past there near Punchell Lake. And I'd get off the school bus, hang out in the mill for a while, and then we'd go home when he got off the shift or whatever. So I kind of grew up in that environment. The smell of the beehive burner, it was kind of imprinted in my brain from a pretty young age. And then of course when I was 14, I think I did my first cleanup jobs there and ended up working full time at the sawmill. Excuse me. And then I also, around the same time, when I was 18, 19, I guess I started tree planting and did that for 3 seasons. Came back to tree planting years later on private land and did more actually just recently, 4 or 5 years ago. And I guess the interesting thing for me about and the privilege I had of doing that is that I planted trees kind of around where I grew up out in the bush, and I got to see and watch those areas change over the years. And I remember pretty clearly what I planted, and it's pretty interesting to see what's doing really well on those places. Pine trees are doing really well, and I know for a fact that's not all we planted. Back then, it'd be probably a 60% pine usually in the bag up. So anyway, I had this background in forestry. My sister went to the forestry program here at UNBC. So I guess I kind of learned a little bit vicariously through her, and started doing woodworking probably about 15 years ago. And to the point now that I've got a little portable sawmill and a four-sided planer, and just today I was like doing a bunch of railing installs downtown. And so that kind of gives me an opportunity to learn about wood from that perspective as well. So Stop the Spray BC kind of started in 2010 when BC Timber Sales was spraying right up to our property line on our cattle ranch up by Punch Hill Lake. And we were aware of the spraying. I guess we were getting maps from Canfor mostly, but also BC Timber Sales. And like there was a lot of spraying that started happening out there in around 2004, 2005. It really started to ramp up. And I'm looking at these maps we were looking at like the back catalog of maps. I'm like, holy man, they're like spraying a lot of cut blocks out here, to the point where eventually they wanted to spray some stuff right up to our property line.
Sorry, what were they spraying?
Glyphosate.
Okay.
Right. So this is the most widely used herbicide on the planet. It is everywhere. It's 80% of people have it in their bodies at any given point in time. We're told it doesn't bioaccumulate, but because it's like so pervasive everywhere in the environment and our food, that it's in a lot of us, the majority of us.
Right.
And, this stuff was discovered after the Second World War. They didn't really know that it killed plants right away. They kind of noticed that a similar, not exactly glyphosate, but a similar type of salt stripped minerals off of boilers. It was like a chelating agent. So that was actually the first patent, not specifically glyphosate, but a very similar chemical was patented to use in cleaning because it could remove minerals off of like mineral scale. And glyphosate kind of does the same thing. So it actually chelates with minerals in the soil, which the effects of which I don't know we really know all that much about. But anyway, they figured out that this stuff kills plants. And they figured out it was pretty harmless to mammals and birds. It is pretty toxic to bacteria, to fish. It's toxic to plants, obviously, and it's toxic to a lot of fungi. And there's a word, the Shittakani pathway. I don't know exactly how to pronounce it, but it's something that, bacteria, fungi, plants have that humans don't, so they think it doesn't affect us. And we're learning a whole bunch about this, right? That it actually has an impact on the microbiome in human bodies, and that can have an impact on our health, physical health, mental health. A lot of that stuff is connected to the bacteria, the health of the bacteria in our bodies. And this is a lot of things that, we're learning about that we don't quite know everything about. So glyphosate was approved for use in forestry once they figured out that it could kill plants and that it didn't kill us right away or directly. It became widespread in agriculture. It got approved for use in Canadian forests in 1984. And it just became really, really widespread across Canada. And Prince George actually was kind of like the hot spot, I'd say provincially, if not nationally, for a lot of this glyphosate spraying. We sprayed a lot of glyphosate around Prince George through the late 1980s, early 1990s. I think the highest amount of spraying that we ever did would have been in 1992, 1993. And then it kind of went down and kind of stabilized for a while. We were doing on average about 16,000, 17,000 hectares a year of aerial spraying. There would have been more backpack spraying. And this isn't even talking about manual brushing, which is something else we could maybe talk about.
So are they spraying just all over the place? Or do they have targeted locations they were going for?
They go for cut blocks around. We did some statistics on it about 9 years after the logging. They will typically, that's when they will spray a cut block. That's the average age of cut block that gets sprayed. So at 9 years after logging, you've planted your trees and you end up getting a lot of birch and aspen, cottonwood, willow growing. And by 9-10 years, that stuff's going to be probably 8 feet tall, 9 feet tall, 10 feet tall. Basically the perfect age for ungulates and large moose to start getting some good cover where they're comfortable going into these cut blocks where you actually have a lot of food in this younger aspen, birch, willow stuff. They did a study back in the 70s in Prince George, and actually year 9 was right when the moose started to really hit the cut blocks. So we know that that's the age when they start to become good habitat for moose, and that's the age we start spraying them with this glyphosate. And the thing about glyphosate is it if you spray it at the right time of year, it will kill the aspen, and anything with a leaf on it, it kills, but it won't kill the conifer trees. And that's because in late August, the conifer trees start to get prepared for winter and actually develop like a waxy layer on the outside of their needles. And the glyphosate with the surfactants, even with the surfactants, doesn't penetrate that waxy layer. So the pine, the spruce, the subalpine fir, Douglas fir, they survive. And all the leafy stuff, which is still growing and absorbing stuff, will get killed. If you spray too early, and this has happened, you'll kill everything. You'll even kill your pine trees. So it's this very, very specific window where they can spray, which is basically late and last half of August, first half of September.
Okay.
Yeah. So they were, just to go back to the story of like how Stop the Spray BC started, we were just given these maps, and they wanted to spray right up to our property line. And, my parents were always kind of a little bit like more nature-oriented type folks. They had beehives. They had a commercial apiary, actually, still do. And we didn't want them to spray because we knew that was going to kill the flowers and the things that the pollinators that our bees would go and feed on. And we knew that the bees would go up to 5-6 kilometers away. And we asked them not to do it. I forget the guy's name right now, but the BC Timber Sales forester is like, well, we already got the contract with the helicopter. So they load these helicopters up with glyphosate, just to back up a little bit again. They got tanks on them, they got spray booms on them, and they're able to basically spray the whole cup block in a few hours.
So we're targeting aspens and these secondary succession species in these cup blocks, but what's the reasoning behind that?
Well, it's just...
Hengda, you might have some input on that as well. But.
Yeah, so I'm coming from a forestry background, and then, in forestry, we have this FERPA, and followed by a regulation, forest planning practice regulation. So legally, you're legally required to bring the block to a state called free growing within 20 years. It's a pretty complicated handbook, but there's a legal obligation the forest community have to bring the cup block back to free growing. So that's one of the excuses a lot of people use to spray, and then manual brushing would be another one. It's controlling the competing vegetation, basically.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, it's like a garden, right? We're trying to grow carrots, and you're not growing dandelions, so you want to get rid of the dandelions because they're going to slow down how your carrots grow. But being in the industry, or growing up in the industry, and to the point that my parents were partners on this woodlot, not far from this place that BC Timber Sales and other corporations were spraying. We had the pine beetle in there. We did a bunch of logging in there. We never sprayed a single thing. We never even brushed a single thing. And, to be honest, a lot of it we didn't even plant. We just kind of let nature do its thing, and we surveyed it. There's a lot of aspen in there. There's a lot of birch, a lot of moose, and it got surveyed, and we're free growing. So actually, if you dig into it, the regulations that we have on the books, big picture, they're kind of strict. So there's a specific thing in the Forest Practices Regulation. It's 46.11 of the regulation, not the act. And that says that you have to have approved stocking standard trees, so like a conifer tree, dominating 95% of the cup block, right? You're only allowed to have a non-compliant species, or like no trees, for instance, on 5% of the cup block. So it doesn't really exactly say you can't have aspen on more than 5% of the cup block, but that's what the end effect of that regulation is. You need 95% commercial conifer. Here it's conifer. Once you get on the other side of the Rockies, you're actually allowed to grow aspen because they have an industry, right? They use aspen for wood products, for OSB chipboard. In Fort Nelson, we actually had an aspen plywood at one point. You can buy aspen plywood at Home Depot that's made in Ontario. So it's actually like an usable wood. It's just because we don't have a factory in Prince George that utilizes aspen, the ministry just calls it a non-commercial wood species, even though it's totally usable as a wood. So anyway, just by virtue of whatever the district forester says is a commercial species and what's not a commercial species, if it's not commercial and it is more than 5% of the cup block domination, then it has to get eliminated back to that 5%. So the 5% is the maximum, right? And actually, it can only be 2 hectares. So if you have 5% of a 100-hectare cup block in aspen, that 5 hectares is actually too big. It can only be 2 hectares. So you actually have to spray that in half or brush it in half and get 2 hectare chunks of aspen in there. So that's basically how the rule works. It took me a while to figure that one out. But that's the one that everybody's worried about, right? But when you drill into it, you can actually have an overtopping aspen around your crop tree. I think you can have 4 of them one in each quadrant, right? And then you can have some ones that aren't overtopping. So you can actually have a lot of aspen and birch and still hit your free to grow target.
What do you mean by overtopping?
Bigger than a pine tree or spruce tree.
And how many years would that take to let them get to that point?
The reason we spray them is because it's the quickest growing tree we got.
Right.
So, I did an experiment in my yard where I didn't mow the lawn, and within 4 years, I had a 10-foot tall aspen tree.
Okay.
They're a pretty incredible tree.
Yeah.
They've got photosynthetic bark, right? So 30%, up to 30% of the photosynthesis that an aspen tree conducts can be accomplished by its bark. So if they have complete defoliation from a tent caterpillar outbreak, they can still create quite a bit of energy just through the bark. And they can actually photosynthesize in wintertime through the bark. And that's one of the theories why the moose like eating aspen bark so much in the wintertime, is that it's still like biologically active and producing sugar for moose to feed on.
So you mentioned how glyphosate doesn't have an effect on mammals or birds for like directly right away. But fish, amphibians, insects, what's been shown that's happened to them?
So it's not just glyphosate that we spray, it's also like a surfactant, and the most common one is POEA, polyoxylated POEA. I forget the exact name, toluamine or something like that. It's an industrial soap, right? And the reason is if you spray glyphosate on a plant that actually has trouble killing plants, it can't get through the layer of the leaf. And so you have to mix it with a soap to allow that penetration for the glyphosate to get into the physiology of the plant. And what they're finding is this surfactant is actually the stuff that's really toxic to amphibians and fish. So it's actually not the glyphosate, it's these other chemicals that they use. And by nature of our regulatory system that's governed by Health Canada and the Pest Management Regulatory Agency, they don't tell us what's in these. Like, we only regulate the active ingredient of these products. So there's all sorts of different glyphosate products on the market. We only regulate the active ingredient, glyphosate, and there's all sorts of different concoctions with who knows what in it. Not just surfactants, but things so it doesn't wash away in rain, things to make it easier to spray, like emulsifying agents. These are all considered proprietary trade secrets that aren't released to the public, even though they're spraying these compounds on our public forests or your food, right? It's pretty messed up. When you start digging into it, like PMRA at Health Canada there's a lot of stories that came out recently, like just last month, the federal court ruled that Health Canada basically ignored 61 scientific studies that had come out when they registered this new glyphosate product called Mad Dog Plus, I think was the name of it. And they literally ignored all sorts of new science that had come out that they're required to look at, and they just kind of ignored it and just approved this new chemical. So there's a lot of stuff in these chemicals, these glyphosate products, that are harmful to fish and amphibians. Might not just be the glyphosate, and beyond that, I'm not a huge expert in this field, like the toxicology field, but there was a study that came out of McGill where they found that low levels of glyphosate, and this wasn't the surfactants, this was the glyphosate itself, low levels, like common environmental situations, had a negative impact on freshwater plankton. And so if you're having an impact on the basis of your food chain in these freshwater systems, that's pretty disturbing.
What's the alternative to spraying? Maybe not from an agricultural point of view, but for forestry, for these cut blocks that we want to grow back healthy and natural.
Well, going back to that woodlot story we had, we didn't spray it, we didn't even brush it, and we were free growing. A lot of this stuff we can just leave alone. That's basically the short answer. A lot of stuff that we logged in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, we didn't spray, we didn't brush. It was a very hands-off silvicultural approach. A lot of those places we didn't even plant. they're looking pretty good. I'm going into these forests. There's a bunch of those places down the Blackwater Road. They're the most diverse forests I've seen. This guy from the government there came up here from Victoria, came up here, and I took him on a tour of some of these places. And, I don't think he was really, it kind of opened his eyes a little bit. Like, I'd go into these natural regen places. There's birch, there's Douglas fir, there's subalpine fir. Like, all the species are in there. You've got 7 species of trees in these unsprayed places. And the conifer's looking pretty good. So, the system that we've got around here, like, gave us pretty amazing forests. It was good enough for the forest industry back in the 60s, 70s when we started. Like, why would we mess around with that? Nature figured something out. Let's just go with that and let nature do its thing. That's my approach, to be honest. If you absolutely feel like, you've got to do something, manual brushing. But you gotta have, 100% pure aspen. You're going to go in there and brush it. Why not just let the aspen grow? We got 50 years to figure out how to use this stuff on the landscape. Lots of time to figure out about building an OSB plant or some other kind of factory to utilize it. Right now in Prince George, which is probably where most of the brushing in BC is still conducted around here, and Hyundai you might know the stats better than me, but I'd say probably 30% of every cut block around here is getting brushed, which means that 30% is probably going to grow back mostly deciduous. You're still going to have 70% conifer in the Prince George area.
Yeah, I don't have the stats, but I do see, forestry, they joke about BC forestry is taking the best, leave the worst, until the worst become the best, and we come and take it again.
Yeah, if you're always logging the big stuff, you're always logging the big stuff.
Yeah. So what happened is, like, people back in the days, they would log stuff, closer to town, like bigger trees and ideal site to regenerate, and those, like, not too wet, not too dry sites and stuff. But after those being logged and then kind of pushing further and higher elevation into those, like, super wet areas, then you have, like, skunk cabbage and some of the really wet vegetation growing on in there. Then if you follow this free growing policy, then again, using this legal thing to get in there to do something, because otherwise it's just too wet to grow. Like,
well, you had Dennis Loxton on. That's an alternative, right? The sheep thing.
I actually really want to be a Shepperd, like just having a bunch of sheeps and running around.
Can you elaborate on the sheep thing?
Yeah, so he used to be an OG planter, and then he also is he runs maybe you know this better. He runs a sheep silviculture, basically using sheep to graze in those cut block, provide, like, summer predator-free grazing area for those sheep. He's got like 6,000 sheep, something like that.
Whoa. At one point, I think he had 30,000. I haven't touched base with Dennis in a while. He keeps, each time I talk to him, he kind of talks about going back to Australia, the homeland. But yeah, I don't know. Is he got another sheep operation going on?
No, he's retired. He's like, I'm retiring. I don't want to think about these stuff anymore. But he used sheep to graze those cut block to kind of help the licensees to bring the cut block back to the free growing state.
Yeah, Bonnie and Tom, I know they live out by Bobtail Lake, and I believe they've got some sheep, and they've done some contracts for Canfor recently. But I mean, again, like, that's like, what Dennis had a problem with. He saw an industry there, right? The sheep industry. He's building up this huge herd right at the same time as everybody went to herbicides. So basically, he went bankrupt because of it, and you need to kind of provide these guys. It's pretty hard to, you got to build barns and build up a herd. There's a lot of work getting that industry going. So if you are going to commit to this alternative of, like, sheep grazing, for instance, like, you've got to keep it on the books and stay committed to it.
Right. Some interesting change like that. We won't go too much more into the sheep thing, just because if people want to know, they can go listen to your episode about it. But were there cons with a project like that? Like, did they go into these wet areas that you were saying brushers might not want to enter? Or?
From what I remember, so they were talking about some of the disease, like that sheep can carry in their foot disease, like a foot rot. So that will infest like ungulates, like deers and moose and elks and stuff. So they get shut down because of that.
Right.
Not didn't get shut down, but like you have to get tested, and that's pretty expensive. And it's just more expensive than using glyphosate to spray, right? Because you just put it in the helicopter and then broadcast the entire. It takes no time, and very easy compared to having a sheep run over and to do that kind of practices.
So I think like another alternative is just to like change harvesting practices as well, because I think when you do these really big clear cuts, like you stop getting seed sources from the conifers, and then if you do get too much competition from herbaceous or deciduous species, basically like you're 100% relying on the trees that the planters put in. Whereas if you did more of a selective logging type thing and left a few trees behind, you'd get more natural seeding, and that would help the conifer regenerate more reliably, probably a little quicker, maintaining the native seed stock from that area, which has benefits. And you don't need to use, like with Douglas fir, like 20 trees a hectare, right? When you log a hectare, you get a lot of wood out of there. 20 trees isn't a lot. You can leave that behind. A lot of that has to do with the machinery we're using, right? Like when you use these big bunchers and these big skidders, they can really, when they're hauling logs out, they kind of roll over everything. But if you start going in there with more European-style harvesters and forwarders and stuff, you can go in there and you can leave a lot more of these like 20, 30-year-old, understory conifer behind that can become future seed trees, and providing habitat for wildlife and a bit more cover. So I think that's another alternative to spraying as well.
Well, is there not enough profit in strategies like selective cutting like that? Is that why it's not more common practice?
I think it's like a little bit more expensive. You've had Liam on your show, I'm sure. You had Liam from Freya Logging?
Yeah, they're talking about like sometimes $5-6 more expensive per cubic meter compared to clear cuts and just using those machines. And but it's very complicated when getting the costs and stuff, because it's relatively speaking,
it's niche. Like you've got to have the right operators. Like if you don't have the right operators, you're not going to make money because it's hard to do. Like, but if you're motivated and you've got the people in there and you've trained and you've invested in the equipment, I think it can be pretty competitive. Is kind of what I'm hearing. But just to expect everybody to switch over to that model tomorrow, a lot of people would probably go out of business.
Yeah, there's a lot of factors that I can imagine go into an operation like that, and you can't just change it.
And I would say another thing is like legislation and policy have to follow as well. Like this free going policy that people being criticized for a while now. Well, they do have a silviculture working group trying to figure out their 4 different pathway to kind of change the free growing policies, and
is that the broadleaf working group that you hear about, or is this another one?
I think it's another one. I think it's called silviculture. I was watching the PowerPoint presentation did online, and from the chief forester office, and I don't remember those 4 different pathways right now, but people are interested. Just search silviculture working group, and they're trying out 4 different things. Just they can allow more deciduous trees, and then And then another thing I would say, probably industry have to follow as well. We need to have facility that can process those deciduous trees. Ontario use Aspen for caskets and whipple, all kinds of things. The engineering.
Almost all the homes in Canada, new construction has Aspen in it.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's tried out. It works. The first facility in Canada to utilize Aspen was actually the Weyerhaeuser plant. I don't think it was owned by Weyerhaeuser back when it started in 1983, but it's in Edson, Alberta. Was the first industrial facility to utilize Aspen. And they make OSB panel there. I actually went there and did a tour. I tried to do a documentary on all this stuff I'm talking about. Never got it done yet. Might happen one day, but I went there, and it's interesting when you tell somebody you're doing a documentary, you get a lot of access, right? Like, oh yeah, come on in. We'll give you a tour. So they toured me around the factory, and actually had their wood engineer talk to me. And it was pretty cool. He said, he told me that Aspen was superior to conifer for doing that type of panel. And one of the reasons is it shrinks less. It's actually a more stable wood, which is really counterintuitive, because when you dry aspen, it likes to cup quite a bit. Like you cut a nice flat board on the sawmill, and then you dry it out, and it turns into a big smiley face or whatever when you look at it from the end of the board. And the reason it does that is because it has a high rate of the shrinkage differential between tangential shrinkage and radial shrinkage. So that's how much it shrinks, like in a line going from the core of the tree to the outside of the tree, is quite substantially different from the shrinkage like along the growth rings, which is called the tangential expansion and contraction. So because of that, that's why it cups. But overall, it's shrinking less than all of our SPF species. So when you get rid of that shrinkage, when you dry it out and it does its cupping thing, and then you plane it down and make it flat, again, it'll stay pretty flat. And when you use it in a chipboard panel, OSB panel, it's more stable, right, than a conifer panel. And apparently it also has a higher strength to weight ratio, he told me, which is also kind of counterintuitive because you think that aspen is a weaker wood, right? And in my experience doing woodworking, I make paddles, canoe paddles. It's actually, well, there's a lot of variety in aspen trees. Some of it is kind of seems a bit weak, but some of it seems like really strong, like stronger than spruce trees. So anyway, it has good application for those types of products. Ainsworth was a OSB factory down in 100 Mile House that I don't know if folks listening to the podcast know about or remember. It shut down a few years ago. But when it got started, they used aspen logs from a lot of it from Prince George area. We'd set it down. We had a log sort yard in Prince George, and you can actually see old advertisements in the newspaper from the early 1990s saying wanted poplar, aspen, cottonwood saw logs. And you could make, actually at one point in the early 90s, you could make more money selling poplar logs than conifer logs, believe it or not, in Prince George. And that was because of that OSB plant down at 100 Mile House. And so they were getting aspen. And then at some point in the early 2000s, we shut down the log sort yard and they couldn't get the aspen from up here anymore. And they didn't have a ton of aspen down at 100 Mile House. So they switched to conifer for their OSB plant. So for the last little while there, Ainsworth OSB was based on conifer. And I have some of that in my shop actually, and it's super heavy. Like you could see the Douglas fir. They're using Douglas fir chips for the OSB panel, which seems kind of a waste. But
maybe for those who doesn't understand OSB, what is OSB?
It's the panels, like the plywood shaped panels, but it's not plywood. It's like it's got all like little chips that are glued together and pressed together. So when you look at it, it's like chipboard. If listeners, go to the hardware store and you ask for an OSB panel, you'll see it there. And all that stuff is almost all based on aspen or balsam poplar, which is cottonwood, related to our cottonwood, but on the other side of the Rocky Mountains.
So do you think in British Columbia, if we had more of a market for aspen, like if it had more economic value, we would see less spraying of glyphosate in the province? Or is there a direct correlation there?
Oh, for sure, because if we had an OSB plant in Prince George, the district forester would probably say, and this is up to the district forester, gets to say that, would probably say that, aspen's a commercial species now. And the moment aspen is a commercial species, then it's an acceptable species and you don't have to spray it anymore. That's the criteria. That's it. That's the only reason we're spraying is because we don't have a big industrial facility that's utilizing it in Prince George. And it's really crazy that we went down this path of we've sprayed hundreds of thousands of hectares of aspen in the Prince George Forest District, like hundreds of thousands, probably 500,000. Those would be pretty big trees. The stuff we sprayed in the 90s would be big trees by now. We'd be having more fiber out there in the landscape than what we have now.
Yeah, transitioning from that, can we talk about the relationship between aspens and maybe how they might slow down wildfires and how leaving cut blocks to rewild themselves might help with that?
Yeah, I've got firsthand experience with that.
Let's hear it.
Back to that woodlot story. So we never brushed it, we never sprayed it, and we ended up having a pretty big patch of aspen on this hill right above this little lake. Beautiful outcome, I thought, of the logging that happened there and this beautiful regrowth that happened and this wonderful aspen forest that showed up on the hillside. And there was some aspen there before, but I think there was a lot more spruce mixed in with aspen. just to like back up a little bit, anytime you have aspen growing around Prince George or America, like in the United States, American West, almost all the time that aspen is growing from a pre-existing root system. So aspens produce seeds, a lot of seeds, but those seeds are like very, very finicky. And they're like, I think like aspens kind of evolved historically to kind of like recolonize land after the retreat of the ice sheets. They like constant moisture, cool weather for those seeds to germinate. Once they get a root system established, they're pretty hardy trees. The root system is pretty strong. It can handle dry spells. It can handle like really rapid, wild fluctuations of temperature and conditions. Like it's a really tough tree, but to get started, they're really finicky. And I've always like watched for aspen seedlings, and I found one last year in a pallet out at the farm. There was a little cup with no drainage in it on a plastic pallet with sawdust shavings in there, and little aspen seedling germinated in
crazy.
And it's about 5 inches big now, so I like planted that in a pot. I planted it in my yard, so we'll see how that goes. But anyway, the point is, like, if you've got aspen growing, like, that's called a problem, like it was in that forest before. It's not like an invasive species. It's not taking anything over. It's just kind of doing what it's done since it probably started growing there like thousands of years ago. That's always why I get bummed out with the glyphosate, because you can kill off that root system with glyphosate, and then you've lost this heritage, right? This ecological heritage that's been there probably for thousands of years. Who knows what is going to happen to that little chunk of land without that aspen root system there. There's a lot of fungi and mycorrhizae that are associated with that. Anyway, back to the woodlot. There, we let this big aspen patch grow. Probably wouldn't be freed growing. That little particular area might be bigger than 2 hectares, but might be right around that level. But anyway, we had a forest fire, lightning strike, back in 2018. Ripped through some old conifer that wasn't logged, ripped through a bunch of the pine that we'd planted and had grown naturally, and it went right up to that aspen hillside, and it stopped dead. So, had the government wanted us to get rid of that aspen, probably the fire would have gone further. I can show you pictures. It's pretty clear. So the government had wildfire crews run there, and what they actually did is they put a fire line between the pine area and the aspen stand. And that's common practice, right? Is they'll try to utilize existing aspen to slow down a fire, and it totally worked, right? So between running the cat, putting a strip between the pine area and the aspen area, and the aspen area being there in the first place, stopped the fire. After the bobtail fire of 2015, I drove through that area, and it was like night and day. Like any place that had aspen didn't burn. Places that had pine and aspen burnt, but it was the pure aspen that didn't burn.
I want to ask, do you see a future in the forestry industry where we don't spray at all? Is this a realistic outcome?
Maybe I can start. I've seen people like Mackenzie, there's no spraying. They stopped spraying a long time ago. Skeena region, there's no spraying. So even Skeena is like borderline coastal ecosystem already, right? So they can definitely do forestry without spraying. That requires a lot of planning ahead of time, and then a lot of when you're doing the layout, you have to think of when you cut down this area, what kind of region is going to regrow. And so there are a lot of techniques the foresters can use, and spraying, as many people say, is just the easy way to handle forestry. That's the lazy way of doing things, and with more and more pressure to, for better practices in the forest sector, then I do feel like there's definitely a future we can do it without spraying.
One critique of spraying I heard from a forester was that you basically take the authority of being a forester away from a forester and you give it to the helicopter pilot, right? You're giving this untrained non-forester helicopter pilot the authority to basically decide what the forest is going to look like, and that's not great for forestry. It's not great for foresters and all that. I'm totally optimistic that we can have a future without spraying. I mean, I don't even think we need to brush a lot of this stuff. I think we can take a much more mixed natural approach to forestry. I've seen it happen in person. We've got on the farm there, private land that we logged in the 70s that we never even planted, let alone spray. Like, it's awesome looking forest. You know, there's all sorts of little techniques that we can experiment with and try that, you know, can get more conifer if that's what we want. But I would argue that we should be looking at more deciduous. And on the landscape, I don't think there's any harm in having more deciduous. If you actually look at the amount of wood we're growing on these sprayed and managed plantations, like, they're growing way better, and we're producing more timber than we ever thought, like, at least in the short term. Like, these pine plantations are growing like crazy. So I think we're going to have a lot of conifer above and beyond what we're going to be able to deal with. I think there's opportunity to get more deciduous on the landscape, to kind of reverse the loss of some of the deciduous we've seen over the last 20 years. Let's get more moose habitat going. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff we could talk about on the show, and I think, like, the moose decline, really big issue. I'm pretty convinced personally that has a lot to do with the reduction of deciduous forest in the replanted cut blocks. So I think to help the moose, I think it makes sense to get more deciduous growing. It's good for fire resistance. And like I said earlier in a show, you know, we've got 30, 40, 50 years before we're going to even think about harvesting these areas. Lots of time to figure out ways to utilize aspen and make an industry out of it.
If people want to read more about this topic, where would you send them?
Well, I try to keep a lot of this. I've posted a lot of studies on the Stop the Spray BC website. I've written columns on these particular ones, like the Douglas fir one I wrote about a couple months back. And then the Facebook page, we try to post studies, and there's so many different layers of this topic. Like, it's not just moose, like cattle ranching feeds into this. It's another little pet hobby of mine. Like, if you want cattle to have good grazing out there in the landscape, especially like south of town where there's a lot of ranchers out there, you want more aspen. Aspens, like, cows will eat aspen trees. They eat the leaves. They eat the stuff in the understory. A pine is just going to starve them out. Like, there's no food for them. Same with moose.
An underappreciated species. I think that's what we can take away from this conversation.
Oh, big time.
Yeah.
Big time. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you, both of you, for coming and talk to me today.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me too.
Thanks for tuning into my conversation with James and Hengda. I hope you enjoyed it. Like I mentioned in the introduction, there's a lot of angles to approach today's topic, but I truly admire the dedication James has put towards the Stop the Spray initiative. If you'd like to read more about Stop the Spray BC, I included links to their website in today's show notes. You can also find the sources to any research I've done for today's episode down in the show notes as well. We referenced some guests Hengda had on the UNBC Forestry podcast a few times in this episode, so to ensure we don't completely leave you in the dark, I've linked any episodes mentioned, which you can also find down in the show notes. Gonna be a lot of clickable links down there. It would be a shame if you missed out on those. I want to thank the Shepperd radio station, located in Prince George, British Columbia, for allowing me to use their facilities to record this podcast. And an additional thank you to the band Funeral Culture for providing me with the song you're listening to right now. If you're interested in becoming a guest on the show, know somebody you think should be a guest on the show, or want to share a conservation story of your own, you can email me at wilderinsightspodcast@gmail.com or DM me on Instagram at wilderinsightspod. If you want to help out the show, consider leaving a rating and sharing this episode with your friends. I appreciate every single one of you who take the time to listen, and if you've made it this far, I like you a little extra. See you next episode.